Hi, I'm Cameron and welcome back to Cameron's Country. In today's video we're going to be discussing the history of the country gentleman all the way from medieval origins up till the present. The origins of the country gentleman start right back in the medieval era. Soon after the Norman Conquest, the Normans had imposed their rule on England by the feudal system. You had the king at the top, then various degrees of dukes and barons and such like, down to knights, and then everyone else who was peasant, serf, a yeoman, varying sort of degrees of hierarchy. In between, there was the gentleman. The gentleman wasn't a member of the aristocracy, but he was likely a son or a son of a lord, probably one of the younger sons who didn't inherit the estate, but had some land, just not very much. Likely enough to get some rent, perhaps even live off the rent, so he may have had to work or may not. Where I've come down to today was actually an estate in medieval times, not of a lord or a duke, but rather a bishop, the Bishop of Ely, who was, at varying points in history, one of the most powerful men in the country. For example, I believe during the rule of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, when he was on crusade, Bishop of Ely was put in charge of the country whilst he was away crusading. So the estates were very important, very powerful, and if you didn't inherit them, well, you wouldn't be too pleased. I guess if you're a younger son, your big brother gets everything, but you would normally be given some land as a kind of a consolation. Take the land and you go look after it, keep you busy. And the people who had that land would be country gentlemen. As I said, they may have tenants of their own, and they likely made enough rent to get by and perhaps choose to do work themselves. And that perhaps leads to the idea that a gentleman was someone who didn't have to work. They weren't aristocracy, but they could live sort of a life of a low degree aristocrat if they chose. So this continued through Tudor times, up into the Stuart times. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of someone who would have been of the class of a country gentleman was Oliver Cromwell. He came not too far away from here. He was born in Huntingdon. He lived in Ely for a time in the diocese and became MP for Cambridge, just to the south. This all led to his rise to power up the ranks through the parliamentarian army, till eventually he became Lord Protector. So it showed that someone at this point in time could do well for themselves as a country gentleman if given the opportunity. Generally, the country was ruled by monarch and his privy council, his courtiers, who would almost always be drawn from the aristocratic background or be sort of people from lower down who had exceptional influence. Another example being the man who became the Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill. John Churchill was a descendant of a family that had lost their land during the English Civil War because they fought for the king, they fought for the Cavaliers. He regained favour under Charles II, James II, and going on to Queen Anne. He actually led the English armies and the Allied armies against Louis XIV during the War of the Spanish Succession. Due to his great victory at the Battle of Blenheim, which pretty much turned the course of the war against the French army, he was gifted Blenheim Palace, which was where his even more famous descendant, Winston Churchill, was born about 300 or so years later. As the medieval era moved into the modern era or early modern era, the code of chivalry, which had been the knightly code or warrior code, became more of a way of conducting oneself socially. And this became synonymous with the gentleman. And perhaps why I think of the gentleman today as someone who behaves courteously, with good manners. They have a certain way of acting that might be described occasionally as chivalry or chivalrous. That goes back to the knight, someone who owned land, and in return for that land, they would fight for the king. So a knight was on a similar level to the gentleman, but it was a more formally defined role, and they had a more formally defined responsibility, fighting for their lord or king. Following from that early modern era, we enter the Industrial Revolution. the Regency era, early Victorian era, there's a lot of industrialization, and the gentleman becomes more of a urban as well as a rural concept. They no longer had to be a landowner as such. They could perhaps be someone who was a merchant, someone who had made money that way. Maybe they owned a factory, but they weren't from the aristocracy. They were from the new middle class. With that growing rural-urban divide of the Victorian era, there sort of developed two separate ways of conducting oneself in the countryside and in the city, or at least certain ways of dressing. We think about that now with the classic "no brown in town" expression, which I think is really rather outdated, but then it was more strict. You would wear black shoes, black suit or dark suit in town, in the city, and when you were in the countryside, you would dress in browns and greens. And that's when tweed began to become more popular, which was, of course, concurrent with the expanding popularity of country sports, hunting, shooting, fishing, and such like. Although those had long been in existence, during this era they began to become more accessible to a larger number of people. With the two world wars, the old system of aristocracy began to break down to a certain extent. A lot of the great estates were slowly divided up and split between ever smaller farms, and the country gentleman became less associated with social rank, although it was still is today associated with upper class to a certain extent. It became more a choice, I would say. I think now being a country gentleman is open to anyone, whether that's pursuing the country activities, everything from going fishing, country sports, to simply, as I am now, going for a walk, which is probably my favourite activity in the world, or if it is the dressing, the fashion of the country, whether or not you're in the country. I think if it's up to you, I want to be here to help you learn about how to bring out the best of that style. So what does it mean to be a modern country gentleman? Well, in my opinion, firstly, if you're going to call yourself a gentleman, or at least aspire to be that, I would never go around and say, well, I'm a gentleman. But if that's something you would aspire to be implicitly, then you've got to live up to the name. You've got to have the courtesy, the manners, respect. Those are far more important than anything visual at all, any form of style. No matter how good you look, if you don't back it up with the right behaviour, then it's all for naught. In my opinion, at least. The style then would come second. Now, it doesn't mean wearing anything in particular, although obviously if you want to be a country gentleman, then there'll be some form of country clothing. But I would say no matter what clothes you have, present them well, dress well, dress respectfully, because you're meeting someone or it's any form of special occasion. Dressing well, dressing neatly, putting your outfit together properly shows a certain level of respect for that occasion, shows that it's important to you and that the people you're meeting, the people you're with, are important to you as well. Also very important would be respecting the countryside itself, whether when you're out and about, making sure you follow all the sort of countryside code things, all pretty straightforward, of leaving gates as you found them and such like, whether it's supporting the local people, the local farmers and the local wildlife as best you can. I think all of that is very important to being a modern country gentleman too. Thank you very much for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed. If you'd like to know more about any particular aspects of this history or about country style and about the countryside itself, please let me know, and I'll be making more videos very soon. And if you enjoyed, please do consider subscribing. It'll be very much appreciated. Till the next video, bye for now.